Welcome to HFY Stories. Please subscribe to the channel. Your one click means the world to me. The tray weighed 10 pounds, cold titanium, still slick with someone else's surgical gel. Dean hefted it like a discus while sparks rained down from a door that had no business glowing red. Three shapes cut through the smoke where the medical bay's hatch used to be, and not one of them looked like they'd come to check vitals. 6 hours earlier, he'd been elbow-deep in a ventilation shaft, worried about nothing bigger than a pressure variance in a scrubber manifold. Now the alarms were strobing crimson across a girl he'd sworn, an hour into knowing her, that he'd never let go cold again. He didn't know yet what that promise would cost him. He only knew the math in his skull, 3 strides to the door, maybe 4 seconds before whoever was burning through that lock reached her bed. It started, if it started anywhere, with a smell Dean hated. Synthesized lavender, piped through vents that should have carried honest engine grease. He was flat on his stomach above the concourse, recalibrating scrubbers for a delegation he'd been told to stay invisible for. Manifolds soft on the lower deck, he muttered into his collar mic. These Celestine folks are supposed to be delicate. They'll feel every draft. Miller, bored 2 decks down, told him to shut it until the Royals cleared the hall. They came in on a walk so smooth it looked like the floor was doing the work for them. 7 feet at the shortest, skin like frosted glass laced with threads of blue light, a carbon hybrid species running on some conductive fluid instead of blood, needing kinetic shielding just to survive off-world. The universal translator had handed them names that surely sounded nothing like the originals. King Albert was, underneath it, some long multi-toned hum nobody bothered teaching the humans. Princess Aurelia walked half a step behind her father. Dean had read the brief. He hadn't expected her to look quite so much like something that could actually shatter. The lights stuttered once. Not a station outage, a pulse localized, the kind that popped ears and lifted the hair on Dean's arms. Down below, the human ambassador just stumbled. The Celestines didn't stumble. They folded all at once, silent except for the wet crack of Aurelia hitting marble. Her guards swarmed her with rods of amber light, and Dean recognized the sound under their panic immediately, the frantic double-time chirp of a machine losing its patient. Through the grate he watched her silver skin go the color of old ash, her glowing veins guttering out one thread at a time. She wasn't bleeding. She was freezing, her whole circulatory system seizing solid, and the medics were waving heat lamps at a problem the size of a dying furnace. He didn't decide to move. His boot found the latch before his brain caught up, and then he was falling, then he was on the floor with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. A guard came at him with an electrified pike. Dean put a shoulder into the alien's chest and watched him skate 10 feet across polished stone like a dropped mannequin. Nobody stopped him reaching the princess. Nobody could. She was fully grey by the time he got his hands under her collarbones. She needs a jump start, not a candle. He snapped at the medic, still swinging uselessly at him. He tore his gloves off and pressed both palms flat against her skin. The cold hit him like plunging his arms into an ice bath, a full-body seizure of pain that locked his jaw and told him, for one long second, that he'd just killed them both. Then his own furnace kicked in. Heart hammering, sweat breaking cold on his forehead, heat pouring out of him in a current he could feel leaving. A crack of static jumped between his knuckles and her throat. Her spine arched off the floor. She dragged in a breath that sounded like broken glass finding its shape again, and her eyes opened, not blank anymore, blazing an electric blue straight up into his face. She grabbed his wrists and held on, drawing the heat out of him like she meant to take all of it, the blue light climbing back into her veins from exactly where his hands sat. The hall had gone dead silent. Every weapon the Celestine detail carried was aimed at Dean's skull, and King Albert stood over his daughter with an expression that wasn't gratitude. It was closer to horror. "You put your hands on her," he said, his translated voice landing flat and enormous in the quiet, "with nothing between your skin and her blood." Dean, still kneeling, still steaming faintly in the cold air, didn't have the energy to be diplomatic. "Those amber rods weren't cutting it," he said, jerking his chin at the discarded medical kit. "She needed a real furnace, not a glow stick. I had one on hand." Nobody shot him, nobody quite dared. The medic, Xyla, the translator eventually supplied, checked his scanner, and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with fear of Dean. Her matrix has bonded to his charge, he told the king. It's the only thing holding the decay back. Albert's face did something complicated. Arrest him, he said quietly. Gently, he may be the only reason my daughter is still breathing. The Celestine flagship's medbay smelled like peppermint and ozone. Dean sat on a floating slab with his boots dangling, wrenchless and unimpressed, while Xyla explained the obvious in frustrated bursts. Dean's bioelectric field had become a surrogate pacemaker, and if he strayed more than 50 meters from Aurelia, her body would read it as abandonment and start shutting down again. So I'm a space heater with a leash, Dean said. Albert, arriving without his ceremonial robes, and looking, for once, like a frightened old man rather than a king, confirmed the leash wasn't the worst of it. The pulse on the station hadn't been an accident. A faction inside his own court had smuggled in a thermal dampener disguised as biological failure, betting no outsider could reverse it in time. They will try again, Albert said, and now they will be aiming at you instead of her. Aurelia allowed herself something close to a laugh. He is unrefined, she told her father, glowing eyes fixed on Dean, and entirely too warm. But I can feel him from across the room, like standing beside something still burning. That was the conversation the ship's hull interrupted. The lurch threw Dean off the slab. Crimson strobes replaced the white light, and down the corridor, something began cutting a hole through a door that had, until 30 seconds ago, been the most secure room on the vessel. Dean grabbed the surgical tray without thinking twice, dumped the instruments, and put himself between the breach and Aurelia's bed, one hand closing around her ankle so the fear in her wouldn't drop her temperature before he could stop it. That was where the smoke found him. That was the strides, the 4 seconds, the tray already weighed and ready in his hands. The door blew inward. Matte black armor, no royal silk, 3 rifles built to shatter crystalline bone with sound alone, and none of them so much as glanced at the human standing in front of the bed until the tray left Dean's hands. It took the lead assassin in the chest, with the full weight of a dense man's shoulder behind it, and the alien folded backward into the corridor with a crunch Dean felt in his own teeth. The second swung a rifle like a club. Dean took the hit on his forearm, tore the weapon free, and drove a boot into a knee that gave like wet glass, the alien going down with a high, cracked chime of pain. The third fired point blank, a wave of concentrated sound that emptied his lungs and rang his skull like a struck bell, dropping him half a step and filling his mouth with copper. Human organs, it turned out, only bruised. Dean spat blood onto the white floor, grinned with red on his teeth, and closed the last of the distance in 2 strides to put his forehead through the assassin's visor. The crack of the faceplate was the loudest thing in the room. Silence after that, broken only by strobing red light and his own ragged breathing. Xyla was under a desk, data pad clutched to his chest like a shield. Albert stood flat against the wall, staring at the wreckage of 3 bodies with the specific horror of a man who had never once watched violence up close and never wanted to again. Only Aurelia hadn't flinched. Her light had gone a deep, pulsing crimson. Drinking in the adrenaline still rolling off Dean in waves, he could feel leaving his own skin. He crossed the room on unsteady legs and sat down heavy on the edge of her bed, knuckles split, one eye already swelling. She reached for his hand before he offered it, her cold fingers finding the current in his palm the way they'd found it the first time, and this time neither of them let go. Down the corridor, his own boots, pacing without his permission, struck the deck plating in a slow, heavy rhythm, and under his hand he felt her pulse climb to match it, no longer racing to outrun the cold, but simply keeping time with something alive. Preston found them like that when security finally cut through the outer seal, and it was Preston who did the talking once Albert had stopped shaking long enough to listen. There would be a contract, the ambassador said, official, concordant sealed, binding Dean to the Celestine crown as a biological support specialist for as long as the princess's own systems needed time to heal. Albert, still pale, still staring at the bodies being dragged from his floor, didn't argue the terms. Dean did. Weekly pay, not lump sum, he said, not looking away from Aurelia. Weekends off when her numbers are stable. And real food, meat, carbs, none of that nutrient paste. Starve the furnace and she freezes, so unless you want to explain that to your board, you're feeding me. Albert exhaled something that might have been a laugh in another life. Done, he said quietly, and for the first time since the concourse, he sounded less like a king issuing an order than a father agreeing to almost anything. Aurelia's fingers tightened around Dean's, faint and steady, her pulse still keeping the rhythm his boots had set, not a countdown anymore. Just two engines, running warm in time.